Good day. Today is Saturday, 1st February 2025, and we've had, as now regularly happens almost every other day, more comments about the situation between Russia and the United States and about the Ukraine war from President Donald Trump. And there's been also some rather interesting comments from Donald Trump's peace envoy, General Kellogg. Let's go first of all to Donald Trump's words. Now, Donald Trump has a tendency, which I remember from his first term, to be extremely communicative. He's obviously a very gregarious man. Unlike his immediate predecessor, Joe Biden, who avoided all possible contacts with the media, who actually was greatly restricted in the number of contacts that he had. Trump regularly mixes and meets with people and talks and says all sorts of things. And it's not always clear quite how much weight one should put on Trump's individual words. Now, I don't want to give the impression that Trump doesn't know what he's saying, which is absolutely not the case. And it's also true that very often Trump does say very interesting things. He was talking, for example, about how there's been a major changing of the guard in the FBI. Lots of people in the FBI are being dismissed. He was asked questions about the fact that many of the inspector generals of the FBI are in the process of losing their jobs. But he mentioned, over the course of one of these gaggles that he had about various things that are taking place, he mentioned that one of the FBI's inspector generals, Michael Horowitz, will retain his job. And Trump mentioned that Horowitz had done an outstanding report back during the Russiagate controversy, looking at the way in which James Comey, the then director of the FBI, had mishandled the Hillary Clinton emails case. And I remember that report very well. I remember a follow-up report that Horowitz also did about certain aspects of the way in which the Russiagate case itself had been handled. It was interesting to me that Trump not only was aware of those reports of Horowitz, but was clearly very impressed by them. He spoke about this in one of these gaggles. And anyway, he went out of his way to say that Horowitz had done some of the most outstanding reports of all over the course of the Russiagate controversy, and that he would retain his job. Now, I consider that an important piece of information. Obviously, it's something that I lived through myself and followed with great interest, but it shows that Donald Trump does have an eye for detail, is aware of an awful lot of that is going on, says many things that are important and are very interesting. And he also says an awful lot of other things. He made all kinds of jokes in another gaggle, for example, about the fact that foreign leaders used to telephone the White House, whilst Trump's predecessor, Joe Biden, who Donald Trump again referred to as Sleepy Joe, was in charge, and that people would tell these world leaders that the president was currently detained, but that he would call back in a week or 2 weeks' time, except that he never did. Well, I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's all there in this really extraordinary freewheeling discussion that Donald Trump had, again, with the media people. So one can't always know exactly how seriously to take all of this. Sometimes, as I said with the Horowitz comments, I think one must take them very seriously indeed. They show, as I said, a president who, despite the fact that he, as I said, is rather florid in the way that he talks, actually is in charge and does control the detail. At other times, we see another Trump, one who is more interested in shaping the conversation, perhaps, the national conversation, one also who likes to feed off the ideas and comments that people make around him. But you mustn't necessarily assume that what you are getting is the absolute, literal, factual truth. Now, this brings me specifically to this issue, this last series of comments that Donald Trump made, because again, he was asked more questions about the air crash in Washington, about the fact that Russian passengers had been killed. He was also asked all sorts of things about contacts between the United States and Russia with respect to ending the war in Ukraine. And Trump again said that he was expecting to have a call with Putin, that he thinks that Putin is keen on having this call, that there are contacts underway between the United States and Russia. He spoke about serious contacts being underway, and that Trump expected that when the call came, Putin and Trump would discuss things and that there would be significant outcomes from this. Now, taken by themselves, and you can find a report about Trump's words from Reuters if you don't want to spend time going through all of the various remarks that Donald Trump makes, which you can, by the way, find pretty much in, I won't say their total entirety, but at considerable length on the White House's website. You can find it, as I said, all in Reuters. Anyway, taken by themselves, these remarks of Donald Trump might suggest that there is indeed now serious diplomatic activity between the US government and the Russian government underway, that the two sides are busy talking about the conflict in Ukraine, that they've already reached some sort of preliminary conclusions with each other, and that a telephone call between Putin and Trump is just over the horizon, and that the two men are going to speak, and that we're going to get significant results as a result of that call. Now, that is what Donald Trump said. Yesterday, Glenn Deason and myself had a video chat with a senior Russian diplomat, Ambassador Polyansky, who is the deputy head of the Russian mission at the United Nations. This is a very senior Russian diplomat indeed, and soon this video is going to be published on our Duran channel. Now, over the course of that discussion, which, bear in mind, took place at roughly the same time that Trump was saying all of these things about all of these busy contacts that are supposed to be happening between the Americans and the Russians. Over the course of this discussion, Ambassador Polyansky, who is, speaking quite openly. I mean, this isn't an anonymous briefing. You can see the whole discussion. Anyway, Ambassador Polyansky, who, as I said, is a very senior Russian diplomat indeed, he seemed to be completely unaware of any high-level contacts between Russia and the United States at all. He was absolutely open about the fact that he couldn't definitely say that there were no contacts, that there were no contacts between the presidential administration, Putin's office, in other words, his own team in the Kremlin and the White House. But certainly Polyansky didn't know or appear to know anything much about it. And I got very much the impression that Polyansky does not actually think that any intense high-level contacts for the moment are in fact taking place. And I am going to express my own view. I think that is true. I think that if high-level contacts of some kind, at the level of intensity that those stray remarks of Donald Trump might lead us to think were taking place, anyway, if such contacts really were happening, I personally find it very difficult to believe that the Russian diplomatic team at the UN, the people who represent Russia at the UN Security Council, which is the cockpit of international diplomacy, the place where the superpowers have the most usual and routine contacts with each other. A team where, as I said, some of Russia's most important and most experienced diplomats are to be found. I find it very difficult to believe that those people wouldn't be in the loop. And I'm going to say something further. I don't see why they would be kept out of the loop. I would have thought that the Kremlin and the foreign ministry people in Moscow would have no reason at all to deny this information to their team in New York. On the contrary, given that we're talking about high-level contacts between the American and Russian governments, I would have thought that the Kremlin would most definitely want their people in New York at the UN Security Council, where, just to remember, the Russians come up against the Americans regularly every single day when there are Security Council meetings, when there are other meetings as well. It is underestimated, I think, by many people who do not follow international affairs, the extent to which New York is the center of international diplomacy, and where it is in New York, in the UN buildings, that the main contacts between world governments happen. Anyway, I cannot see what possible benefit there would be to the Kremlin or to the foreign ministry to keep their people in New York uninformed if these contacts were taking place. And Ambassador Polyansky pointedly reminded Glenn Deason and myself of something further, which is that the Russians currently do not have an ambassador in Washington. The previous ambassador, Ambassador Oleg Antonov, who headed the embassy in Washington throughout the period of the Biden administration and had to navigate and run things in the embassy during arguably the most challenging time. Anyway, his term as ambassador ended in, I believe, November. The word in Moscow is that the Russians immediately selected his replacement, informed the Americans of who the replacement was, but they're waiting for the US authorities to approve of this replacement, to confirm that the new ambassador will be accepted by the host government and will receive proper diplomatic accreditation. And for the moment, there has been no movement on this at all. The Americans have made no response to the increasingly urgent requests from the Russians as to whether or not the ambassador is indeed going to be approved. And Sergei Ryabkov, Deputy Foreign Minister, one of the most senior people in the Russian Foreign Ministry, he has said that this is becoming a serious issue because without an ambassador in overall charge, the Russian embassy in Washington isn't able to function fully, and without an ambassador, it's impossible to conduct an day-to-day dialogue, an intelligent day-to-day dialogue with the new authorities in the United States. And Ryabkov said that, we're not yet at the danger point when the absence of an ambassador threatens the entire viability of diplomatic contacts between Washington and Moscow. But we are slowly drifting towards that point. Actually, he said that we are rapidly drifting towards that point. Now, whether the Americans are trying to make some kind of point by delaying the accreditation of the Russian ambassador, whether this is part of some kind of psychological poker game, one which I think the Russians themselves don't fully understand if that is the purpose, I don't know. But again, the fact that there is no Russian ambassador in Washington seems to me to make it unlikely that there are in fact extensive diplomatic contacts, negotiations, if you like, underway between the Americans and the Russians, of the kind that Donald Trump was speaking about. And certainly Ambassador Polyansky, when Glenn Deason and I spoke with him, seemed to think that the absence of a Russian ambassador in Washington made the establishment of that kind of dialogue all but impossible. So, again, could it be that Donald Trump is again signaling in some way, in some complicated way to the Russians that he wants a dialogue to start, but he wants the Russians to make the first call? Maybe that's what the purpose of all of this is. There may be an idea in Washington that this is the way to gain some kind of psychological advantage over the Russians. Or it could simply be that the Americans still haven't worked out their plan. They haven't really thought through what exactly it is that they're going to do. And so for the moment, they're treading water and are continuing to signal publicly their interest in dialogue with Moscow, without, however, taking any very active steps for the moment to take it forward. By the way, there are reports today that Rick Grenell, who is very much one of Donald Trump's people, has been sent to Venezuela on some sort of mission where presumably he will be speaking to Nicolas Maduro. And this is coming apparently at the same time as there are reports that a Russian government plane is flying to Caracas in Venezuela. And I've seen a number of people put 2 and 2 together and make 10 and say that some kind of secret discussion between the Russians and the Americans is going to take place in Caracas in Venezuela, of all places. I have to say that I think that is certainly wrong. Of all the places in the world where the Russians and the Americans might meet, I think the least likely for the Trump team to choose as a venue for top secret negotiations would be Maduro's Venezuela, given how Donald Trump and the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, are known to feel about Maduro. My guess is that Rick Grenell is going there to put pressure on Maduro to stand down. That's been the pattern that we've seen for some weeks now. And as for the Russian plane flying to Caracas, if it really does exist, well, I would have thought that was just another routine diplomatic flight. Anyway, there we go. We'll just have to wait and see what is going to happen. But the other person who has been speaking and has been saying some quite interesting things is Keith Kellogg, General Keith Kellogg, Trump's peace envoy. Now, this is all, again, very interesting because Kellogg, arguably, if there is a diplomatic initiative underway, ought to be the point man leading it. He is, after all, the peace envoy. One would expect, for example, that he would be getting in touch with the authorities in Moscow on the US government's behalf. He would be seeking meetings with senior Russian officials to discuss whatever peace initiative he has, and perhaps to travel to Moscow, where he might have serious prospects of meeting with Lavrov and Putin. I think if Kellogg were to go to Moscow as a peace envoy from Donald Trump, there is a real possibility that Putin and Lavrov would meet with him. So far, again, that hasn't happened. But that hasn't stopped Kellogg from speaking. Now, again, Kellogg did say some very interesting things. He said that he still wanted to try to end the war in some form within 100 days, but he did seem to me to be a lot more qualified about that. He did seem to understand that this is a very complex conflict and that it might take a lot more than 100 days. Importantly, he said that it is in the US national interest for the war in Ukraine to end. He said, obviously, it's in Russia's national interest for the war to end, and it is in Ukraine's national interest in the war to end. He reminded everybody pointedly that Ukraine, over the course of this war, has lost more men than the United States lost in the Korean and Vietnam wars combined, which, by the way, would mean that Kellogg believes that Ukrainian losses, and he means dead here, are in excess of 100,000. And perhaps he's got information about this. But anyway, that is what Kellogg said, that the Ukrainians do have an interest in bringing the war to an end, as, of course, according to Kellogg, do the Russians as well. But this is the first time, to my knowledge, that Kellogg straightforwardly said that ending the war in Ukraine is in the US national interest as well. And for what it's worth, I thought that he appeared to downplay the prospect of the Trump administration imposing further sanctions on Russia. He said that it was not for him to decide whether or not there would be sanctions on the Russians. This despite the fact, by the way, that in his famous April 2024 article, the one that eventually led to him being appointed peace envoy. Anyway, in that article, which he wrote with Fred Fleitz, Kellogg did float the possibility of further sanctions against Russia. But now Kellogg is saying that this is absolutely and exclusively up to Donald Trump himself to decide. It's not for Kellogg to say one way or the other. Now, I have to say that Kellogg's words were, or at least came across to me, as being rather conciliatory in the way that they are being addressed to the Russians. And this same is true of all of the words and comments we've been getting from the Trump administration over the last week, ever since, in fact, that ill-judged comment on Truth Social that Trump made about 10 days ago, in which he appeared to threaten the Russians with tariffs and sanctions and taxes and all those sort of things. The overriding impression that the Americans are giving is that they do want to talk. They do want to find some way to end the war in Ukraine. Importantly, Kellogg, again, did not set out any ideas, just as Marco Rubio in the interview that he gave, which I discussed yesterday, was very careful to say that he was not going to pre-negotiate the terms of the peace. Kellogg is no longer doing that either. The Americans seem to have accepted that coming to the Russians with pre-prepared plans, ideas that they want to see implemented, is not the right approach. That all that will lead to is the Russians turning down those proposals flat and the negotiations coming unstuck the moment they begin. Anyway, we will see. It is all difficult to judge exactly what is happening, but I do wonder whether this latest flurry of comments from Kellogg might be a sign that someone in Washington is finally about to give him instructions to start making positive diplomatic moves. And maybe we will start to see him flying to Moscow in the next couple of days, when, to be clear, his primary purpose will be to re-establish dialogue with the Russians and to set up the conditions for the call between Trump and Putin finally to happen, and for the two men to move forward towards some proper meeting with each other. Anyway, let's see. Now, of course, Trump is talking about other things as well, and what he's talking about is very interesting as well. Now, he has been saying an awful lot about tariffs. Again, on one of those press gaggles that I spoke about, Trump reminded everybody that between about 1870 and 1913, the glory years, as he sees them, of the US economy, the period when the US economy achieved its most rapid growth and established itself as the world's leading economy. He's right about that, by the way. In historical terms, he's perfectly correct. It is this period from after the end of the US Civil War until the First World War. It's that period, which is indeed the period, when the United States did establish itself as the world's single most important economic center. Anyway, he reminded everybody that during this period, the United States did not have a federal income tax, that the US government's funds were entirely financed through tariffs, and the result was very rapid economic growth, and that Trump believes that that is the way forward for the United States again, that it should return to that kind of approach to, in effect, the American system as it was described by economists like the German Friedrich List at that particular time. A continental, self-sufficient, rapidly industrializing economy with low taxes but high tariffs, with industries able to develop under behind protective tariff walls, but with free markets functioning freely within those tariff walls, and with steps taken eventually to prevent monopolization and to break up cartels and trusts. That's the world that Trump looks back to as the optimal period of US economic policy. And, well, Trump returns to this again and again, the lodestar for him being still the presidency of William McKinley in the 1890s, the period just before the United States embarked on its vast program of territorial expansion. McKinley being somebody who was not keen, for example, on the Spanish-American War, which played out during his presidency, just saying. Anyway, the point is that all of this, one can argue about the logic or the merits of all of this, but anyway, Trump clearly seems to believe this, and he has now confirmed that the administration is indeed going to start to move towards imposing tariffs. 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico, 10% tariffs against China, more tariffs against the Europeans, a fundamental change in US economic policy, reversing the entire economic direction that the United States has been taking ever since the Second World War. If we go back to the Bretton Woods Conference, to the various changes that happened, to the radical changes in economic approach that began in the 1960s under JFK, the consistent trend is for the United States to ease off tariff barriers, to increase federal rates of income tax, to seek liberalization of world trade wherever that is possible. All of this, of course, evolved into what was called the Washington system in the 1990s, where the United States sought completely free movement of capital and goods wherever possible, with the expectation that capital and goods would flow into the United States. Just saying. Anyway, Donald Trump wants to take that and to reverse it completely. And the tariffs against Mexico and Canada and perhaps China are apparently now just weeks away. So this is hugely consequential. It's perhaps more important to Trump than almost anything else at this time, apart possibly from the ongoing massive purge that continues to work its way through the federal bureaucracy. Every day one gets word of more and more people from more and more departments getting sacked and dismissed, or suspended, or subjected to investigations, and that kind of thing. The entire federal government is being rebuilt. The whole of American economic policy is being rethought and recast. And perhaps it's not surprising that, given all that, the president and his team have not yet had time to work out a full diplomatic strategy on how to approach the end of the Ukraine conflict, though they have now clearly signaled that they want the conflict to end and some kind of rapprochement with Russia, or at least normalization of relations with Russia to take place. And of course, I spoke yesterday about Marco Rubio's interview and how he seemed to be, if he didn't seem to be, he clearly stated that the era of the unipolar moment has ended, that the United States now sees itself as one great power in a world of competing great powers. The multipolar world has begun. So we'll see where we go, but I'm going to suggest, if I can give some words of advice, I think it would be a good idea for the US to just agree to the appointment of the Russian ambassador. I know who it is, by the way, that the Russians have proposed. You can find the name of this person in the Russian media. There's no secret about this. And he seems to be an extremely professional and experienced diplomat who speaks English and knows the United States very well. Anyway, I think they should just agree to have him appointed. And I think they should send Kellogg to Moscow. That should be the first order of business once the ambassador arrives, and then we can finally get some kind of proper dialogue between the US and American and Russian governments underway. Now, I want to go back briefly, before I continue, to the program that Glenn Deason and myself did with Ambassador Polyansky. And over the course of that interview, Ambassador Polyansky said something else which I thought was very interesting and very important. So, by the way, did Glenn Deason. After the program had ended, Glenn Deason and I discussed it with each other. Now, over the course of that video, Ambassador Polyansky said that in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, in terms of establishing a dialogue in order to try and find some way towards peace in Ukraine and ultimately Europe, or Western Eurasia, as the Russians now increasingly prefer to say, the best way forward would be for the parties that talk to be the Americans and the Russians alone. The Europeans, as well as the Ukrainians, should be kept completely away. Now, I want to make something absolutely clear here. I was involved, obviously, in the making of that program. It's absolutely clear to me that Ambassador Polyansky was stating his own personal opinion. He was not speaking for the Russian government. He was not expressing Russian government policy. He was stating his own private preference. But he is nonetheless a very senior Russian diplomat, and I suspect that this opinion that he has, that there should be exclusively dialogue between the Americans and the Russians on Ukrainian issues, reflects very much the opinion in Moscow. I think most people in Russia, within the Russian government, feels that the only way that discussion can take place, and can take place successfully, is if the Ukrainians and the Europeans are kept out of it. And Ambassador Polyansky expressed himself in very strong terms about the Europeans. He said it was absolutely clear that they had lost all agency over the course of this conflict, that they hardly counted any longer as a serious negotiating party. But of course, the main concern that Russian diplomats are going to have is that the Ukrainians are clearly, for the moment, unreconciled to any serious peace, any peace that would come remotely close to satisfying Russian conditions. And that the same is true about the Europeans also. Now, I say that there's just been another article in the, I believe it was the US media, saying that there's now a split in Europe between the British and the French on the one hand, who want to send a huge force of peacekeepers to Ukraine to try to enforce peace in Ukraine once the ceasefire that they're still thinking about comes into effect. And other European governments, which for this purpose include the Germans, who are telling the British and the French, you must have taken leave of your senses. This makes absolutely no sense. There is no conceivable way that we're going to send armies of peacekeepers to Ukraine, quite apart from the fact that the Russians would never agree, the European public would never agree. We could not even think of going to Ukraine unless we got absolutely ironclad guarantees from the Americans to protect our people if they did go to Ukraine and found themselves in a tangle with the Russians. And Donald Trump is never going to give that guarantee. So why are you even bringing this whole topic up? And interestingly, it looks as if some of the East European states, Poland, for example, are opposed to this idea of sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. They're saying, what on earth are you talking about? Why send your troops to Ukraine, of all places, where they are meat on the plate for the Russian military to carve up and devour? We need these troops in Poland and in Eastern Europe, not close to the Ukrainian battlefields where the Russians can obliterate them, because it's in Poland and in those places that the new front lines after the war are going to take shape. Now, obviously, on this, I am on the side of those people in Europe who are opposed to sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. The point is, I am absolutely bewildered that this discussion is even taking place still. The fact that Starmer and Macron are still plugging this idea shows how completely detached from the realities they still are, and how completely unreconciled they are to the inevitable outcome of the Ukraine war, which is a Russian victory. When you are dealing with people who are so completely detached from reality, who are so wholly intransigent in their approach to the war, you absolutely do not want to involve them, or so it seems to me, in negotiations, which they would not believe in, and which they would be certain ultimately to wreck by making demands of the other side, of the Russians, which the Russians inevitably are going to reject. Now, here I do want to make one quick observation about Keir Starmer, because I've been on the receiving end of a number of comments about Starmer's 100-year agreement with Ukraine. All sorts of people have been coming to me and they've been telling me that it's inconceivable that Starmer is so completely detached from reality, that the 100-year treaty really doesn't mean anything, that the fact that Starmer signed it at all and that he did so for a period of 100 years shows that he doesn't expect Ukraine to survive a year, let alone 100 years, and that this is all part of some kind of complicated Machiavellian game that Keir Starmer and his government are playing, though the purpose and objective of that game is one that nobody seems to agree what it is. Well, I followed Keir Starmer very closely in Britain, and I'm going to say this about him. Say what you will about Starmer, what you see is what you get. I think that if he signed a 100-year agreement with Ukraine, He did so because he sincerely believes that this is a meaningful and real document. He might be the only person on planet Earth who thinks that way, but he probably almost certainly does think it. I think that he remains as committed to Project Ukraine as he says. I think this is true of the British establishment as a whole, by the way. And I think that not only do the British take this bizarre treaty or agreement or whatever it is perfectly seriously, but the fact that they have signed a treaty like that is a compelling reason to keep them far away from any negotiations. That, at least, is my view. Now, if we come back to Europe, it may be that over the next couple of months, things will change. Emmanuel Macron in France has now apparently plumbed the lowest depths of his popularity since he became president of the Republic. He did some kind of bizarre video, which I haven't watched and don't intend to watch, which was apparently intended to rehabilitate himself in the eyes of the French people. Predictably, it had the exact opposite effect. There's very great uncertainty about the stability of the new French government headed by Monsieur BITCHUTE that President Macron is trying to form. It seems to me that there is at least a possibility that we could be seeing new elections in France at some point within the next few months. I mean presidential elections, with Macron finally put in a position of checkmate where he is forced to step down. And, well, I'm going to say, I think if such elections do take place, the probability is that we will have President Le Pen, or perhaps, if not President Le Pen, a president from the Rassemblement National, and it is likely the French foreign policy will change. In fact, I would be astonished if in that case it didn't. And in Germany, I have just seen the results of a private opinion poll showing the apparent strength polling rating of the parties 3 weeks before the federal elections in Germany take place on the 23rd of February. Now, I don't want to disclose the results of this poll because I believe that so far it is a private poll. I expect that it will be published shortly. And of course, it is only one poll. And it may be wrong. It may be that other opinion polls will show a different rankings for the parties. And as I said, we still anyway got 3 weeks to go. And the rankings that I saw in this poll could change in all sorts of ways between now and the election on the 23rd. But having said all of that, if the results of this opinion poll were really eye-watering, if they are true, if the figure that is given for support for the AfD and the figure that is given for the CDU-CSU, the party, the bloc which is supposed to emerge from the elections as the biggest force in the Bundestag, if these polling figures are true, then all I can say is that Germany is in for an electoral shock of a sort that I'm going to suggest is going to put the entire prospect of Germany continuing with Project Ukraine, continuing its support for Project Ukraine, an immediate and critical question. That's all I'm going to say. Now, we have some telltale signs in Germany that the trends are indeed in this direction. We saw this extraordinary diplomatic maneuver that Friedrich Merz, the leader of the CSU, just tried to carry out, in which he tried to get a vote, an anti-immigrant vote, through the Bundestag. Advisory vote, by the way. This is purely theatre, and had to rely on the AfD for support, roundly criticised by Angela Merkel, by the SPD and the political establishment in Germany, by the German churches, by much of the media. There's uncertainty at the moment about whether Merz's manoeuvre has benefited him. If this opinion poll is correct, by the way, then it seems not, that it's reinforced views, which I have, that Merz is starting to panic and is starting to make reckless steps which are giving German voters a sense that he is starting to panic. Anyway, this strange parliamentary manoeuvre by Merz might be a sign that the results of this private opinion poll that I have seen may be correct. But there's been another one today, which is that the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, member of the SPD, rival of Olaf Scholz, a man who has projected himself very much as a pro-Ukraine hardliner, an advocate of increased defense spending. Anyway, he has come out publicly and has spoken out against Germany seeking to allocate 5% of its GDP to defense spending. Pistorius said that this is unaffordable, that it would use up 42% of Germany's budget, and that this is simply not something that Germany can realistically do. And again, I can't help but feel that this is a kind of admission that signals the extent to which the political landscape in Germany is shifting. So it could be that in a few months' time, if we do have elections in France, and after the elections in Germany, the political landscape in Europe will have changed sufficiently far that it might become possible for the Americans to start consulting with their European allies, who could finally be led by more realistic and rational governments, and that this might facilitate the process of negotiations with the Russians. But unless and until that happens, I'm going to say it, I agree with Ambassador Polyansky. I think that if one wants to move forward, for the moment, with negotiations, to try and find some way out of this crisis in Ukraine, some way that the United States can extricate itself from Ukraine, whilst preserving its core interests in Europe and limiting the geopolitical damage that comes from Russia's victory. Well, if this is going to happen, then it can only be done for the moment with Zelensky and the Europeans kept firmly away at arm's length. just to get a sense of how difficult it is to do anything with the Ukrainians at the moment. We've just had another speech from a Ukrainian representative at the PACE meeting. This is the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, just to say. Not an EU body, but a pan-European body, but one from which Russia has been excluded from all participation, and which the Russians have made clear they no longer want to be involved in anyway. Anyway, a Ukrainian representative came along to PACE and said quite publicly and openly that it would be an excellent thing and a wonderful idea if the West could arrange to have President Putin assassinated. That this is something that the West should embrace rather than avoid. Assassinating the leader of the world's biggest nuclear power. Well, this has not so far provoked any strong reaction from Europe. None of the big European leaders have said this is crazy, this is irresponsible, we cannot in any way be involved in this kind of thing. There's been no demands from Zelensky to repudiate the words of this parliamentarian. There's been no pullback in Ukraine itself. Zelensky has not come out and said that this individual was talking out of line and that this isn't Zelensky's policy or that of Ukraine. It'd be very difficult, by the way, if the Ukrainians said that that was not their intention, to take them seriously. It is now universally acknowledged that the Ukrainians have indeed conducted assassinations inside Russia. A few weeks ago, they assassinated the military commander of Russia's nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare troops. Just saying. And a couple of months ago, no less a person than Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, openly acknowledged that the Ukrainians have made several attempts to assassinate Putin, though up to now, unfortunately, obviously, these assassination attempts have been unsuccessful. So if Zelensky did deny what this Ukrainian parliamentarian said, I don't think many people would take his denial seriously. But the fact is, there hasn't even been a denial. There's been no repudiation of this comment. And can one seriously, honestly feel that a government that talks in that kind of fashion is really a government that can participate in negotiations? Now, there is something else which has happened, or at least has been alleged over the last couple of weeks in fact, that might also mean that it would be a good idea to keep Ukraine, at least, as far from negotiations as possible. Not a new idea, by the way. In responsible statecraft, Anatol Lieven has already said that given the kind of stance that the Ukrainians are taking, it might be best to keep them at arm's length. But the Russians, over the last few weeks, have stepped up their claim about war crimes committed by the Ukrainian army. They've made allegations of that kind about the murder of civilians in Selidovo. This is, of course, a Donbass city south of Pokrovsk that the Russians captured a few weeks ago. The Russians put together a dossier putting these allegations in one place. They arranged for an informal meeting of the Security Council at which this dossier was presented. And over the course of the program we did with him, Ambassador Polyansky mentioned that the American representative on the Security Council, who's a career diplomat, not so far a senior official, gave a rather muted response, which surprised the Russians to these Russian claims. The American representative did not do that which the Americans often do, which is vehemently deny the claims and accuse the Russians of committing aggression and that kind of thing. Anyway, the Russians have made allegations about Ukrainian war crimes in Selidovo, and they're now making similar allegations about Ukrainian war crimes in Kursk region against Russian civilians, specifically in the village of Ruskaya Porechnoye. Now, a couple of days ago, about a week ago, on the Duran, Alex and Christoforou and I had an interview with Patrick Lancaster, intrepid reporter, and he has, of course, been to Ruskaya Porechnoye. He's one of the, as far as I know, he's the only Western reporter to visit the town. And he did report some very troubling things. You can go to the video and you can see what he said. And bear in mind, these were eyewitness. This is reports that Patrick Lancaster made as an eyewitness. I absolutely no doubt about their accuracy. He was very, very careful and very properly not to jump to any conclusions, and nor do I, but we certainly did agree that there is a serious issue which requires investigation. Well, the Russians have now undertaken an investigation, and they are making claims, and they are, by the way, identifying suspects who they say are members of the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, I am not going to judge this because, as I said, I am not there. And with these kind of allegations, I always take the line that they need to be examined and reviewed by impartial third-party agencies, which sadly in war situations almost never happens. But given that these allegations are now circulating and they're getting considerable traction inside Russia, it might also be best, given that the Ukrainians have openly admitted that they've conducted assassinations inside Russia, it might be best if the Ukrainians in any negotiations are indeed, as Ambassador Polyansky says, kept at arm's length. Anyway, there we are. I ought to say, obviously, that when the negotiations come to some kind of an outcome, if there is an agreement about Ukraine, then Ukraine will have to be consulted and will have its word and can say yes or no as the situation dictates. But I cannot see why in the meantime the Americans and the Russians cannot talk to each other. As I have said previously, the Biden administration mantra, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, is impossible. It gives the Kiev authorities a veto over American diplomacy, which, in my opinion, is straightforwardly absurd. It is ludicrous that a superpower like the United States should be tied down by its proxy in that sort of way. Anyway, we will see whether negotiations happen. We will see what happens over the coming days and weeks. But meanwhile, the war goes on. And I said yesterday that the war in Ukraine is now intensifying, that after the fall of Velikaya Novosilka, we'd had this brief period of thaw, which had transformed the landscape into mud. The ground has hardened again. The skies have cleared, which makes it easier for the Air Force, the Russian Air Force, to operate. And the Russians are back on the attack. And the overall commander of the Russian forces, General Gerasimov, has also been on the move. He has visited the front lines. He's met with some of the senior commanders. He's handed out decorations. He's attended the headquarters of the Russian army group, which recently captured Velikaya Novosilka. And it is a reasonable guess that whilst he was there, he discussed with them the operational plans that they will now be expected to follow after Velikaya Novosilka has been captured. And most people believe that the Russian military grouping in Velikaya Novosilka will probably turn towards the southwest, seeking the encirclement and eventual capture of the important Zaporozhye town of Gulyapolye, town with an important role, by the way, in Russian 20th century history, especially during the Civil War, the Russian Civil War of the 1920s, but I'm not going to go into those sort of details. And, of course, if Gulyapolye and the nearby town of Orekhov fall, that opens the road for the Russians to advance towards the great city of Zaporozhye, on the Dnieper. A city which, it's important to remember, is the capital of Zaporozhye region, and which the Russians therefore claim to be Russian, not Ukrainian at all. Anyway, elsewhere, the Russians have also been incredibly busy. Over the course of last night, they conducted a massive missile offensive against Ukraine. Now, so far as I can tell, this does not seem to have been conducted using air-launched cruise missiles. The Russians have been busy expanding production of their ground-launched ballistic missiles, their Iskander-M missiles. About 2 weeks ago, I said that alongside the Oreshnik, I'd received reports that the Russians were in the late stages of developing and putting into production another long-range missile, one which would be equipped with some kind of thermobaric warhead. And sure enough, over the last couple of hours, there's been reports that precisely that kind of a missile, another member of the Iskander family apparently, is about to enter production. It has double the range of the current Iskanders, and, well, there is no word that it carries a thermobaric warhead. But if the physical limits involving such warheads can be sorted out, why not? Just saying. Anyway, it looks as if the Russians now are increasingly using these missiles, which of course for all we know might be supplemented by North Korean missiles. There's been many reports about this. But anyway, the Russians last night conducted a major missile strike across Ukraine using ballistic missiles. And it's believed that the Ukrainian energy complex, the gas distribution system, command positions in Odessa, a hotel in Odessa, the Bristol Hotel in Odessa, which might have been used for all sorts of purposes which we don't know. Anyway, all of those were targeted by the Russians over the course of yesterday. Again, the contrast between these enormously powerful Russian strikes with ballistic missiles or air-launched missiles and, of course, very powerful drones, and the pinprick attacks that the Ukrainians conduct with their drones against Russia. The contrast is extraordinary. Anyway, there we are. Meanwhile, the Russians continue their advance. And yesterday, I mentioned that it looks as if the Russians are in the process of completing the destruction of Ukraine's Kurachovo group. This was the group of brigades tasked with defending Kurachovo and the area around it. Is now withdrawn to a cluster of fortified villages, Dachnie, Andreevka, Urakli, Rozlev, Konstantinopol. There's been many reports over the last 24 hours of major Russian advances in this direction. There's also been many reports that the Russians have now resumed their offensive around Toretsk, that the various pinprick attacks that the Ukrainians carried out around Toretsk have now all been rebuffed. The last few hours, just before this program, I started making this program, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the village of Krymsky, which is located to the northeast of Toretsk, adjoining the Toretsk coal mine, has now passed fully under Russian control. It looks as if the Russians have now decided that the moment has come to finally wrap up Toretsk entirely. Probably there was some kind of troop rotation. The Russians withdrew some of the brigades that had been fighting in Toretsk probably over the last few months. Whilst the rotation was underway, the Ukrainians used the opportunity to carry out some raids on northern Toretsk, but that now looks as if it's conclusively over. And elsewhere, there are reports that the Battle of Chasiv Yar has taken a decisive turn. Redovka, the Russian newspaper, has had a detailed discussion of this. They say that the Ukrainians, trying to hold on to their remaining positions in central Toretsk, near the industrial zone, which has passed under Russian control, have been obliged to weaken Chasiv Yar's flanks. They've been obliged to redirect troops from the flanks to try to hold their positions, their remaining positions in the center of Chasiv Yar. That doing so has enabled the Russians to fold the flanks so that the Ukrainian grouping in Chasiv Yar, now limited to a small area of the town, is at serious risk of encirclement. And it seems that there's more mopping up operations going on in another railway station in the Chasiv Yar area. I gather there's several railway stations around Chasiv Yar, this being an area where railway stations sort of come together. So this battle at Chasiv Yar is going very badly. Further north, there's been more reports of a major expansion of the Russian bridgehead on the west bank of the Oskol River. The Russians captured a small town in this area a couple of days ago. They've now apparently captured another important village. The area of the bridgehead has become significant. It seems that armoured vehicles are now able to cross on pontoon bridges across the Oskol River. It looks as if a major armoured fist is being created by the Russians. And again, the big question is, What do the Russians intend to do with it? Do they intend to move north to take the Ukrainians still holding out in Volchansk, where a group of forces north say that Russian raiding parties are now regularly crossing the Volcha River from the north of Volchansk into the south, and where the Ukrainians have been now largely pushed out of northern Volchansk? Do the Russians aim to attack the Ukrainians from the rear in Volchansk by pressing north from this bridgehead that they've established on the west bank of the Oskol River? Or are they, as I would have thought, be more likely, are the Russians going to swerve south, encircling and finally capturing Kupiansk and launching an offensive to retake Izium and Balakleya, the places in Kharkiv region that the Russians ceded to the Ukrainians in the autumn of 2022. We are very close to the point, probably in the spring, maybe after the Rasputitsa season. It's very likely that the Russians will launch an offensive in that direction as well. But in some ways, the most dramatic news is coming from Kursk region. And here I would quickly say that, again, perhaps as a product of the new administration in Washington, the great narrative about the mighty North Korean army being deployed to Kursk region, well, that is now melting away. There's been an article in the New York Times which says that after experiencing heavy, though it must be said invisible losses, the North Korean force in Kursk region, which has been mostly invisible as well, has been withdrawn from Kursk region by the North Korean command. So apparently, after weeks and months of being told about how there is this mighty North Korean force in Kursk, it looks as if there is no longer any North Korean force in Kursk. I have to say, this whole story of the North Korean soldiers in Kursk is not just an astonishing exercise in cynicism and absurdity. It really is a shameful testament to the way in which the media, the mainstream media in the West, has handled the Ukrainian story, that a story that has been so completely lacking in substantiation has been accepted as true and has been endlessly recycled and repeated as if it was true. The Ukrainians have various times claimed that they've tried to capture North Korean soldiers. They've provided all kinds of pictures and photographs, none of which have stood up to much serious examination, claiming that this provides evidence of North Korean soldiers. The very fact that there's been issues about many of these photographs ought to have been a good reason to doubt this story. The Ukrainians have then said that they did capture some North Korean soldiers, but these soldiers died almost immediately. Then we were told that 2 North Korean soldiers had been captured alive and are in Ukrainian captivity. And now we've heard for some time nothing more about them. Apparently the South Koreans tried to access these people, but they weren't able to, supposedly because these 2 North Korean soldiers refused to defect. This phantom army of North Koreans in Kursk region has now essentially vanished into the Kursk mists, which probably tells us all one needs to know about its fundamental fictitiousness and unreality. Anyway, putting all aside the story about the North Korean soldiers, and remember that story had consequences. The Biden administration in November pretended that they had decided that they'd reversed policy and decided to authorize missile strikes inside Russia using ATACMS missiles as a counter to the presence of North Korean troops in Kursk region. And now, as I said, it told that these North Korean soldiers have all gone. Anyway, putting all that to one side, the situation in Sudzha, in Kursk for the Ukrainians is becoming increasingly disastrous. It seems that the Russians, after a lot of battles south of Sudzha, have indeed captured the village of Makhnovka, which lies immediately to the south of Sudzha. There are reports that they're in process of capturing another village, Zamostye, which lies immediately on the southern boundary of Sudzha. There are reports that the Russians, having captured Ruskaya Porechnoye, where the war crimes are supposed to have been committed, are now in the process of capturing Cherkasskaya Porechnoye, and that they've also re-entered Martinovka on the main road to Kursk region, and that they are in the process of storming Svedlikovo, which lies to the northwest of Sudzha, not that far from the main road between Sudzha and Sumy region, the only road that the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region can use for their supplies. And it's increasingly looking as if the fighting in Kursk region is starting to spill over into Sumy region in Ukraine as well. Not only are the Russians launching missile strikes and bombing strikes now regularly on Ukrainian troops in Sumy region, but increasingly FPV drones are being used inside Sumy region to attack Ukrainian positions, which, given that FPV drones have limited range, suggests that there is now a significant Russian military presence inside Sumy region participating in this battle, which is of course the greater battle for Kursk region as well. Well, all of this is disastrous, but of course it all comes in conjunction with the information about the Ukrainian army melting away. Now, I've had information, this comes from a Russian media outlet, so you don't have to accept it if you don't want to, but it's a compilation which I believe is true. Anyway, it sets out the extent of the desertion crisis. It gives some indications about the extent of the desertion crisis that is now affecting Ukraine. It says that the 157th Brigade, this is a new reserve brigade, created in 2024, ceased to exist in 2025, with 1/3 of its soldiers deserting before becoming operational. It says that the elite 155th Anna of Kiev Brigade, this is the French-trained brigade, saw at least 1,700 of its 2,300 soldiers desert before reaching the front lines. Now, that is absolutely true. It's being confirmed by Ukrainian sources, including by the Ukrainian commentator Yuri Butusev. It goes on to say that over 10% of the 13,000 Ukrainian soldiers sent to Poland for training fled the country. It said that desertion is occurring in both large and small groups, with 22 soldiers from the 71st Separate Jaeger Brigade deserting in just 1 week in December 2024. The media outlet and goes on to say that deserters are even charging to assist others escape, with one man arrested for smuggling soldiers out for €7,000 each. Then there's a quote attributed to General Sergei Krivonos. General Krivonos is a celebrated Ukrainian army officer. He's a critic of President Zelensky's, so for that reason, he has had no active role in the Ukrainian army since the start of the special military operation, but he's become an incisive and very, very critical commentator within Ukraine about the conduct of the war. Anyway, he says, apparently, that for every 100 mobilized soldiers, only 10 reach the front. Presumably, the others desert. Another Ukrainian activist, Gennady Druzenko, apparently has estimated that there's an estimate of 150,000 deserters, and a Ukrainian parliamentarian, Anna Skorohod, also estimates that there were over 100,000 deserters by October 2024, and a Ukrainian commissioner, Olga Reshetilova, has stated that the problem is big and people are exhausted. By the way, I've also seen a report saying that Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are speaking out against the proposal to enlist 18 to 25-year-olds. They're saying that these young men would lack morale and would have limited training and would not really be effective on the battlefronts, which is an interesting revelation. But anyway, the point is that the Ukrainian army is melting away, even as the Russians are landing ever heavier punches. And as we see in Kurachovo, and by the way in Chasov Yar, and as before long we're going to see, I suspect, north of on the west of the Oskol River and in Kursk region, for the moment, the Russian objective continues to be the destruction of Ukraine's armed forces on the battlefronts. But we're coming very close, perhaps a couple of months, as the Russian Defense Ministry said yesterday, to that moment when the cascading collapse becomes so bad that the entire front line will disintegrate. And at that moment, following the logic of the Russian-Soviet doctrine of deep battle, developed all the way back in the 1930s by people like the Russian military theorist Triandafilov, at that point, we could start to see movements on the battlefronts of a speed that we have not seen at any time previously in this war. So, to repeat again, there isn't a huge amount of time left if negotiations to rescue Ukraine are going to take place at all. Whether those negotiations anyway are going to get very far, whether the Russians at this point in the war are really even interested in negotiations, that remains to be seen. But it's important to remember always that all of these discussions about negotiations are not being conducted in the abstract. The war goes on, and with every day, Ukraine's defeat comes closer and its scale gets worse. Well, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. If you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And, well, thank you again, and there'll be more from me soon. And until then, have a very good day.